thank you for joining us today, together with, and I'm still utterly stunned by this, a total of 106 viewers on this streaming channel right now. And yeah, with that immense amount of excitement, I welcome all of you to our very first Game Studies and Engineering lecture on Twitch. My name is Felix, I'm the program director, and today I'm going to talk about a topic called promenading along a British utopia / dystopia in the Chinese rooms, Dear Esther. Now this lecture is actually, let me adjust the headset a little bit. This lecture is actually a part of a lecture series titled Visual and Digital Utopias, Visual and Digital Utopias. Today's lecture is basically the guest participation from the master's program Game Studies and Engineering of the University of Klagenfurt to this lecture series. And I can only repeat how utterly excited I am. You might hear me saying so a couple of times while we are on this Twitch, simply because this is an amazing feeling, I have to say. I finally get why so many people are actually streaming video games, not even 5 minutes into the business, and this is perfect fun already. But let's maybe start a bit with a more general introduction to the topic of game studies, because as typical for a lecture series, all the different lecture contents that you get come from different departments. So not all of you might be too familiar with what game studies actually is and what game studies does. So we should begin with a bit of an introduction and a bit of a warning disclaimer, perhaps, that yes, this is game studies. So what's the kind of background that I have when approaching a topic like Visual and Digital Utopias? What are the kinds of artworks and cultural artifacts that I'm dealing with, and how am I, or how are we at a master's program dealing with them? At a very basic level, game studies is, of course, the study and the analysis of games, but this is also including the social and cultural impact that video games leave. This, on the one hand, leads, of course, to a grander scale. So what roles do video games play in society? Think about topics like the often in press and journalism cited video games and violence, for instance, but also video games as cultural reasons for celebration, online tournaments and streaming, which is, of course, in the times of COVID-19, a rather big and prominent topic. How can we stay in touch digitally and virtually via video games? And with our focus on video games, we have something that is a rather great boon, but also a challenge for us in our part of in our academic study field, namely the topic of interdisciplinarity. Now, I don't know how many of you regularly play video games, but if you play video games, or even if you just merely look at video games sometime, you should know that there's quite a lot going on in them. Video games are text. There's usually some kind of text input. There's sound. There's visual media. There's visual appeal. Many, especially higher produced video games nowadays, try to somewhat approach the look and realism of a film, for instance. But there's also the layer of interactivity. How can we interact with a video game? At times even networked interactivity. So how does a video game allow us to interact with people who we might not even know in person, not even see, but who are there with us in a virtual environment in order to do something together? So there's many quite interesting things that we can look at, but at the same time, of course, this can be overwhelming. So whenever analyzing a video game, it's really important that you carefully select a focus on what you actually want to look at in order not to get lost. Our focus, especially at the University of Klagenfurt, lies within interaction and the human side of things, or the humanistic side of things, humanities in digitality and virtuality, meaning, of course, what does it mean for us as human beings that we have these immense opportunities of virtual environments going on for us nowadays with so many different video games and so many video game productions? How can we express ourselves artistically via the medium of the video game, for example, or what things can we actively take away as learning experiences from playing a video game? How do they shape us as human beings, and how can we benefit from them in our cultural domain as human beings? With that being said, and you might have guessed that by now, the self-made experience is quite important to researching video games. So on the one hand, it's going to be quite fun, at least I hope so, for you guys to watch me play a video game today for you and to analyze it while we're playing it. At the same time, I highly encourage you to make this experience for yourself. Dear Esther is a rather old video game. Not age-old, of course. It's not an arcade classic or something, but it's old enough to be rather achievable. You can get a copy of Dear Esther for, I think, something around 10 euros right now on bigger services like Steam, for instance. And if you like what you see in this lecture, and if you really want to get in touch with the video game, there's no way around it. You cannot just watch stream after stream about it. You cannot watch Let's Plays about it. Of course you can, and this is definitely helping your vision and your understanding of the video game. But you will definitely have to play this game for yourself at some point. With that being said, we can go over to our agenda for today's lecture. I'm going to take a rather specific approach to the idea of utopia and dystopia by first and foremost establishing a spatial sense of the meaning. With Dear Esther, we are having a virtual environment. It's a rather specific game world, a rather specific kind of geography and gaming geometry that we are moving in and around. And so for us today, it's going to be of an utter importance to know what utopia or dystopia means as a space, as a confined space for us to be in. We will then explore this space together in a live stream of Dear Esther, in which we aim for an understanding of the game's realization of a freely traversable utopian and dystopian trope. Throughout the entire lecture series, you will encounter different topics, like in the very first session by Professor Jörg Helbig, for instance, who talked about Pleasantville, that a rather static medium or a medium with which we don't interact can give us a whole different outlook on utopia than a form of utopia where we actually have agency, where we actually have the opportunity to interact with an environment. And afterwards, which I estimate to be at around 13:30 or 13:45, we are going to have some time for questions. I try to keep an eye out on that little chat window that I can see here. So if there's something that you really, really want to know or really, really want me to do, you can leave a message in there. However, I have to be clear about it. I'm not promising that I'll be able to check the chat constantly, because by now I already noticed that doing a proper stream while doing a PowerPoint presentation at the same time is quite a lot of multitasking. But we will manage, and we are going to have loads of fun with this one. So let's begin with an introduction to the actual game itself. Yes, SDG Rio, I'm actually writing my dissertation on that video game. This today will mark at least my 50th or 55th playthrough of the game. I mean, we're not going to manage a full playthrough, but yes, I know this game in and out. I actually had the opportunity to interview the lead developer, Dan Pinchback, about the game at certain occasions. And yes, I'm really deeply into the Esther. And thanks to that, so will you today. Now, Dear Esther is a video game released by the British development studio The Chinese Room in 2012. At least that's the date that marks the commercial release of the so-called Landmark edition of the video game. Landmark edition in this sense, meaning that it's a kind of a expanded version of the video game. It had a slightly better graphics. It has an audio commentary that you can actually listen to while playing the game, which is super interesting. But originally, the game was actually created as a mod, a so-called modification of the source game engine released by Valve in the year 2004. The word source, or the name source, is one that certain gaming enthusiasts among you might know already. It's basically the foundational code for video games such as Half-Life 2, for Team Fortress 2, for Counter-Strike Source, for instance, as well. And based on this engine, a rather small development studio made the game Dear Esther, which was a real interesting take, actually, because the source code has thus far been used almost exclusively for first-person shooter experiences, first-person shooter video games. And now with Dear Esther, these people realized a project that was utterly different, not only from first-person shooters, but from many, many other video games in general, which led us to a public release of the video game that created an extremely divisive momentum amongst journalists, but also, if we can actually call it like that, amongst the gaming community or a public reception in general. On the one hand, Dear Esther has received immense praise as an artwork, got several highly acclaimed awards, won many of them because it's poetic, it's deep, it's insightful, it's doing something with a gaming engine that not many games have dared to do before. But also for that very reason, it has been criticized as a game as such. So if you look for reviews on the Esther online, you will either find highly artistic claims or you will find people telling you that this is not a video game. Most famously among them, for example, Ben Yatze Croshaw, who is a journalist for the magazine The Escapist, and who up to this day argues that Dear Esther shouldn't even be called a video game at all. A opinion that I'm highly suspicious about, because I think if we really want to gain an understanding of the medium of the video game, we should see that there's just a vast variety of what a game can do. Just think about the kinds of video games that we have right now. All of them are utterly distinct and unique, and still we would consider all of them a video game because they give us that opportunity of interacting with a virtual environment. However, this is an important point to mention, because ever since Dear Esther, or at least in a rather renewed and refreshed sense with Dear Esther, this taxonomic uncertainty, is it a video game, is it not a video game, is a topic that is regularly brought up in public discourse and in press coverage of video games, especially of the more artistic variety. There's always the question going on, should we actually consider this to be a video game or not? And yeah, this is something that was, at least in recent times, kind of initiated by Dear Esther. Mainly because Dear Esther, as I hinted at already, plays rather different than many other video games before it. And it, at least in recent opinions, shaped a genre that we would like to call the walking simulator henceforth. As said, Dear Esther is often cited as the origin of the genre of the walking simulator. However, if we take a closer look at the history of the video game, we can actually see that a lot of games that do stuff that Dear Esther did in 2012 has happened before that already, going back to as early as 1983, as far as I could find out, with a video game called The Forest, which was all about the player having to maneuver through a forest and reach different checkpoints among it. So the entire idea of the walking simulator has been with us since the 1980s, but we could say that publicly and with a much broader attention, it has been resurfacing with the walking simulator. The walking simulator as a genre has certain genre markers, we could say, that more or less differentiate it from other video game genres. Of course, there's always the odd one out, there's always the exception, there's always the video game who's not fulfilling all markers precisely. Think about Wittgenstein and his idea of family resemblance, for example, to make sense of that. But certain things that quite often define a walking simulator are, needless to say, the focus on exploration by promenading. Yeah, who would have guessed that a game that is called a walking simulator is all about walking? But that's, of course, a central point of it. Walking simulators are about being a part of a virtual environment and exploring it by having a avatar, our virtual self in the secondary reality of the video game, explore this environment by walking through it. By and large, we could say that walking simulators are mechanically restrictive, yet aesthetically intricate. So there's little ways for us to interact with the environment. Usually it's just walking around and having minimal interactions, as in I can turn a flashlight on and off, I can open a door or close a door, I can open and close shelves to look into them, but not much to do besides that. So what walking simulators do by restricting these mechanic inputs that we can give into a video game is that they allow us to focus on other things that we can do in a video game. They allow us to really focus on what's left for us to do, namely moving around. And with that, also looking around, seeing different things, paying attention to our environment, paying attention to what's going on around us, and really letting sink in what, for example, this beautiful island panorama that we can see in the starting menu of Dear Esther already does to us and how it makes us feel. This, of course, also leading back to the fact that video games or walking simulators has often been criticized not to be real video games because they are lacking this intricate level of mechanical interaction that other video games have. For the common walking simulator, self-made experiences are the main reward of play. It's not about winning something, it's not about achieving a high score, but it's about the experiences that you make along the self-made way that you walk through any given virtual environment in these cases. And with that, it's also quite clear that walking simulators are hardly ever relying on set challenges or forced modes of exploration. So rarely in walking simulators do you have time limits, do you have enemies, do you have extremely complex puzzles that block your path. It's really about the sense of feeling part of being a part of that virtual world. And this is something that is of quite some historical relevance, actually, because walking is not something that the walking simulator has specifically invented for the video game as a kind of very specific practice that we can do. But walking as a cultural practice has been with us since antiquity. For example, in a quite prominent example with Aristotle's philosophical school of peripateticism. So the way in which Aristotle taught and educated his students at the Lyceum was a way of movement. At least that's what people say about him. According to myth and to legend, his teaching style was defined by walking together with students and talking while walking and integrating the things that you get from your environment into the actual discussion. Now, quite often this is claimed to be a myth, but what other people claim this is more or less because Aristotle and his students had to meet in the walkways, so in the places where you walk in order to have the discussions. But it's also a proper reference to how you can allow a thought to develop. Yeah, that's actually quite a cool metaphor for thinking. Thinking is a process of movement. It's something that occurs to you when you go to different places, when you consider different things, maybe when you return to a place that you've been to before in order to compare past knowledge to prior knowledge, for instance, and so on and so forth. And besides these schools in antiquity, walking has played an immensely important role in cultural movements of Romanticism, in which walking has been seen as an important motive that is reconnecting mankind or the human being with nature, but also as a kind of liberating act. Think about the middle class in the Romantic era, for instance, people who were severely confined by social rules, by norms, by restrictions, perhaps by rather tight and confined spaces where they had to live with a family. Whereas walking meant that you could be in nature. Walking meant a liberating act of privacy, as Kurt Wölfel called it, for example, where you can be for yourself and with your own thoughts, where you can see, where you have the ability to freely spectate. In a broader sense, also where you can see that you can be seen by others, bringing us to one important motive of Romanticism and Romantic literature, for example, namely the idea of the flaneur, which would be the character who goes on about walking. Think about, that was rather in the early modern age of writing. Think about Henry James's Lambert Strader, for example, as a main protagonist who takes the reader by the hand and shows them Paris in the sense of walking through Paris and consciously watching what's going on around them. These were very important motives for literary tropes and characters. In modernism, we have walking as a very important phenomenon in artistic and cultural movements such as the Dadaist movement or the Situationist movement, where you had people making the sense of spaces and understanding spaces in a sense that would go beyond the logical, go beyond the reasoning, go beyond the mathematical, go beyond the architectural, in the sense of a city has to be structured in a certain way, but who would you could say let the flow take them through a city, for instance, and just take them to places where they feel like going after seeing certain things, where they can make specific associations, where they can pay close attention to visual elements that weren't perfectly designed, forgotten gardens, little spaces that nobody's making use of. These were things of important interest to the conscious walking experience of the Dadaist and of the Situationist. And this was also a time that gave us a certain methodological toolkit, which allows us, in the case of the Esther, for example, to make sense of virtual spaces. For example, I would like to mention Guy Debord's idea of the dérive, the idea of walking in an environment and really letting yourself dissolve within it and paying close attention to inner processes of reflection. You pay close attention to how an environment makes you feel, what associations you got with it, what it makes you do. Does it make you feel confined, anxious about something? Does it feel liberating? But also not just to what you see, of course, also what kind of things do you hear at a given place? What do you think about who has shaped the place where you are right now? Important motives of that kind of art movement. And perhaps just as a little outlook, of course, walking still plays an important part in today's art movements. Think about topics like urban exploration, for example. Yeah, nowadays it's cool to go out and to trace down exotic places, abandoned factory houses, abandoned warehouses, half-collapsed buildings. Of course, don't do that. That's rather risky, but that's what some people do in order to get a more direct and intense feeling and understanding of how the past has shaped certain places. Now, where are we on our lecture slides? Yes, so by now you can see that the idea of place is of rather great importance to the walking simulator. Allow me one sip of coffee, please. Can't go on without a bit of caffeine. I'm sorry about my vices, but that's how it goes. And with that, I really want to set today's lecture focus on a spatial sense of utopia and dystopia, which is an important distinction. Quite often when we speak about utopian ideals or dystopian ideas, it's often about a rather political or ideological sense. And in many visions and versions, the utopia or the dystopia is a state of political perfection or imperfection, a state of harmony or totalitarianism. And it's really focusing on how society works as a whole. But I, for today's session on the Esther, really want to go back to the idea of the etymological rules of the Greek word topos, namely place. Utopia as a place, or rather as a fictitious non-place. That's where we got the U from, utopia, the non-place. Or its close, originally defined connection to the word play on oitopia, which is Greek for the good place. So the utopia is a place that is made out not to be existent in reality, and it's a place of perfection of some sorts. And in many visions and versions of utopian stories, we therefore need somebody to introduce this world to us. And therefore, we quite often have an important key figure in shape of a traveler of sorts. Somebody who, through whatever fantastic mean, is able to leave our reality and to enter a non-reality, a non-place, a utopos, in order to allow us to have a comparison and to show us how this other world achieves perfection in a way that we don't. Okay, this is how society functions there. And now, as I come from Earth, I can tell you how society functions on our planet, where the differences are and why these people do better than us, for example. Another key term besides the utopia with that would of course be the dystopia or the non-utopia. I put that into single quotation marks because quite often dystopia is simply taken as a kind of counterpart to the utopia. Yeah, everything that the utopia is, the dystopia isn't. But that's a rather simplistic point of view. Of course, we know that the utopia is a darker vision. It's the vision of something that's not really working out, of something bad. But we should really stick to the idea of vision as a key term, perhaps, here, because the utopia might be a positive outlook on the future, whereas the dystopia quite often is a negative outlook on the future. And with that stated, we can already see that the change between what's a utopia and what's a dystopia is ever so slightly. Think about Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, for example, which is a dystopian novel, which at the same time tries to manifest and to portray a rather specific kind of perfectionism. We have a perfect society, but the perfect society came to existence at the cost of something else. And so quite often the dystopia is not simply or merely a countervision, but the dystopia is something that can be a satire or a grotesque of the utopia. So yeah, that there is something that that is great, but we have to be aware of the fact that this greatness comes at a very specific cost, comes at a high cost, or is always at a tipping point of turning into something bad. I really think Huxley did a very amazing job with portraying these fine lines. And I also think that Dear Esther is taking us along a very similar way on a thin line between perfection and imperfection, between the utopian and dystopian. And I think with that, we actually achieved a point where I talked for long enough, and I will actually take you into the game world now together with me. So let's start and play Dear Esther for a couple of minutes. You can see that the video game environment is divided into 4. Dear Esther is a rather short game. If you are really taking your time playing it, you should end up at roughly 4 to 4.5 hours. So the first chapter, The Lighthouse, could potentially be done in an hour. Nevertheless, I don't think we're going to finish this one today because I really want to focus on specific details and discuss them with you guys. So let's click on it to allow the game to load. And to all you humanities people out there and to those aspiring to be humanities people, to us in our studies, in literary studies, for example, it's always important to pay attention to the beginning. So how does the game actually introduce itself to us? How does it start?
Dear Esther, the morning after I was washed ashore, salt in my ears, sand in my mouth, and the waves always at my ankles, I felt as though everything had conspired to this one last shipwreck. I remembered nothing but water, stones in my belly and my shoes, threatening to drag me under to where only the most listless of creatures swim.
That's how the game opens, with a introduction that resembles a letter rather closely. From this point on, we can see that Dear Esther is a epistolary game, so to speak. There is a narration going on, but what we get to learn about it all comes from letter excerpts that are revealed to us as the player. Allow me to quickly open the next slide so that you get a bit more from the experience here. So what we have going on is a fade from black, which is quite often taken as a visible representation of somebody opening his or her eyes, or opening their eyes, for instance. And this is our introduction to an island panorama with a lot of water taking up a majority of the screen space, and from here we can begin to move around. I really love these early beginning moments of a video game because it really gives us a sense of wonder. What role am I going to play in this video game environment? And we can, from this point on, note that from how we can see this environment, we are playing a first-person perspective game. So we are incorporating an avatar, a virtual alter ego who is a part of this video game world. Something that I always like to do when I know that I'm playing an avatar is to look straight down for a second, because sometimes you can see the feet of your avatar, sometimes you can't. In this case we cannot, which is rather interesting because the avatar of course tells us a lot about the role that we have to play in this environment. And in the case of Dear Esther, we are playing a so-called shell avatar, which means that our avatar is here to give us some kind of fixed point in the video game environment. At the same time, however, we know nothing about this avatar. We don't know if we are the protagonist of the narration going on. We don't know if we're a side character. We don't know how important we are. We don't know if we are male, female, if we are human to begin with. We know nothing about ourselves, which plays an important role in our later understanding of Dear Esther's utopia or dystopia. We can move around in a walking fashion, so that resembles a human at last. And we can see that if we turn around, there's nothing but water besides us. There's no boat besides that one, but we started behind that boat actually, so it's rather unclear why we're starting at this position precisely. And what we can see is the island panorama of a Hebridean island, at least estimating and assuming from rock formations and from the vegetation we are going to encounter later on. So we are in an island that could as well be one of the British Isles. And these are the places that we can see at the beginning. Now you can, while I play for a little bit, already make up your mind if this actually looks utopian or not to you, and what might speak for it being utopian or not utopian or dystopian maybe even, according to your own understanding of the term. This is where the exploration element kicks in already. Of course, as a player, and right now imagining that I'd be new to the video game, I would of course love to check everything out that is in my vicinity. I want to know where I can walk to, where I can't walk to. Okay, I can drop down on these rocky cliffs here, for example. I can't just jump over these rocks because I don't have a key that allows me to jump. And the only thing I can do right now is somewhat crawl back on here and drop into the ocean, apparently.
Come back.
This is what happens when we drop into the ocean. We don't die, or at least it's not expressed in a way that makes us believe that we died in this gaming occasion. But we got a fade to black. We heard a sound in the background that resembles a heartbeat a little bit, at least in my opinion. And we are brought right back to the island with the words "come back." So apparently swimming away from the island is not an option to us. One decisive moment we have right now would be right here, where we can decide if we actually want to take the upper path or the lower path towards a potential beach, for example. I see a mentioning of the music being utopian. Yeah, thank you very much for that, SDG underline Rio. The music is definitely an important part in this one, because the music, even as an extra diegetic feature, as something that we expect is not coming from the game world itself, is something that elevates the video game environment. This is not a photorealist approach. It's looking photorealistic, but at the same time it's brought to a higher aesthetic level by it being underlined with music that has a rather sentimental touch to it. Yeah, it's a bit sad in its notes, but at the same time it's not scary. It's not providing us for I don't know, a monster coming out of that abandoned lighthouse. And this is how we walk across the island. We have absolute freedom in movement. However, we do have restrictions by the game geography, of course. So we can go everywhere that these paths allow us to go. But at the same time, there is no driving force in a rather direct fashion. There's nobody forcing us to walk. We can return and walk back at any given moment. And what I really appreciate about walking simulators, we can take our time and just let the moment sink in for a second. There's no time limit forcing us to go on. There's no text line popping up saying, hey, you have a quest to do. There's something really important for you to do. Which is also an interesting phenomenon about Dear Esther and about many walking simulators in general. It is rather unclear why we're here. Usually, or at least many Western video games, for example, are defined by clear definitions of winning conditions and goals. There's always a target to achieve, and we can have a vague understanding here that our target might have something to do with exploration, but there's nobody telling us, do something, go this way, try to jump into the ocean 50 times to see if you always come back or not. That's all fully dependent on the time we want to take with this game. And as we can see here already, the environment is not empty. There are things lying around for us to find. So here we can see something that might be tools for catching crabs, for example. But we also see other kind of litter lying around the beach. We see plankton. And at that point, I actually have to do something in order to show you, music coming in again, to show you something rather special about Dear Esther's virtuality. And for that, we have to restart the game.
And how many visits I have made overall. Certainly the landmarks are now so familiar to me that I have to remind myself to actually see the forms and shapes in front of me. I could stumble blind across these rocks, the edges of these precipices, without fear of missing my step and plummeting down to sea. Besides, I have always considered that if one is to fall, it is critical to keep one's eyes firmly open.
Spot the difference 101. What happened here is that we not only got an introduction to the island, but right now we got a different introduction to the island, which is a very interesting phenomenon about Dear Esther. We get a changing voiceover to begin with, so we got a different kind of letter excerpt. It did start again with Dear Esther, but its contents were different from what we got before. And this is giving us a load of implications for our understanding of the virtual world. Right now we have the implication of an unreliable narrator, because no matter how often we start a game, we always get different letter excerpts. These letter excerpts are triggered by us reaching different points across the island. And every time we get a letter out of a specific pool of letters that are detached to specific points. But these excerpts are always different. So no matter how often we play, we always get a different combination of letters, making us not only experience Dear Esther in a different way every time we play it, but also giving us a multi-perspective version of a narration going on here. A narration that is highly unreliable at certain points. Sometimes we have letter excerpts that partly contradict one another. We have letter excerpts that don't really add up. We still have a lot of blank points missing here. And so every gaming experience is different from the last one with regards to these excerpts especially. However, there's also items on the island that we don't find on every playthrough. And it's not just parts or items or props that are different. It's also quite often props that are rather unfitting for the island environment that we're in. For example, at certain points of the island, we can find parts of cars. We can find car doors. We can find a steering wheel. We can find hospital equipment lying around, bloody syringes, other kinds of items that we would associate with a hospital atmosphere. We can find urns in different points of the island. So there's something wrong about this island because these things shouldn't be here. There's no indication for us, even through later playthroughs, that the island would be big enough to host a car or give us any reason that somebody would have to take a car over there. And there's also, even more intense than that, changing encounters with each playthrough. I don't know if many of you have paid attention to the middle window that we see on screen right here, but in some playthroughs there's actually a person standing behind a window watching you. You can barely make them out and they are hurrying away as soon as you approach the building, but sometimes they're there. And at many other parts of the islands we can actually see ghostly figures watching us from the back. They never approach us. They always disappear as soon as we can get an eye on them, and they never appear in the same places. Again, there are certain places that usually trigger these ghostly appearances, but it's really rare that you get all of these ghosts in one playthrough. So what we can already assume is that we have an island that is changing constantly with every visit of us, and that's also marked by elements that shouldn't really be on it, giving us a clear indication that this island is indeed a metaphorical topos, a kind of non-place. This island might be based on a real island, but at least in the way that we're exploring it, it's not a real island to us. It's first and foremost, of course, a island taking place or being located in the virtuality of a video game. But within that virtuality, we can assume this island to be a metaphor for something larger, for something else going on. The only thing that is not really changing much about the island is the landscape in its very general ideas and its design, which we can link back to an actual artistic art tradition of the 18th and 19th century Great Britain, namely the art tradition of the sublime and the beautiful, which has been wonderfully described by Edmund Burke as a kind of feeling, passion, or sensation that is caused by the great and sublime in nature. So nature is always an important part of the sublime and beautiful that creates astonishment, and astonishment in it that it is a state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. So we can see that, for example, in a painting by John Martin that I attached below, The Plains of Heaven, what makes the sublime and beautiful being sublime and beautiful, namely the fact that you have a landscape that is beautiful to look at, but at the same time is giving you an eerie feeling for a reason. That could be because nature is presented as a powerful force with the beach washing ashore. It could be nature being kind of scary looking in the sense of there's harsh cliffs, there's places that look scary in the sense of that you could feel like being lost in them, being far away from civilization. So basically everything that the Hebridean island setting of Dear Esther is giving us. And quite interestingly, the medium of the video game is adding a lot to this feeling also, because our understanding as a player is that something could happen to us at any time in a video game. Especially based on the interacting factor. We don't know what happens if we do certain things. So that alone, combined with us not knowing of what this game is about, is adding to that sense of wonder because we want to explore, but also to the sense of danger. Hey, something could maybe happen to us in the gaming environment. Moreover, the video game adds to our understanding of art in admiration and creation. Of art in general. That's something that Ursula Brandstetter explored in her wonderful paper on the general notion of the aesthetic experience, in which she explained that art is on the one hand beautiful because somebody else created something that's cool for us to look at and that we like to enjoy. But at the same time, part of the aesthetic experience is making art ourselves. And that can mean that we do something physically with our hands, we brush, we mold clay, things like that. But at the same time, making art, in the sense of Dear Esther, for example, also means that we make art by setting a certain framework in a video game. Yep, the way I look at this lighthouse right now is, in a sense, aesthetically pleasing to me, because that's how I want to look at it. And this raises two interesting points for us in the analysis of video games. On the one hand, it's the fact that video games tell stories and create aesthetic moments in a fashion that is slightly different from other forms of media representation. We have Henry Jenkins doing major research in that field, and he is speaking of 4 narrative options that video games have. Video games are narrative in the sense that they evoke narrations. So everything that we experience in a video game gives us a sense and feeling of something. So a dark corridor with a thunderstorm going on outside might give us the idea of, hey, that's something that we associate with horror, for instance. Or the island landscape in Dear Esther giving us an association. This happens in every lecture I do, whether it's online or not. So please enjoy my short moment of I would like to rewind my speech pattern and do it again, but we're just sticking with that right now. So the idea of evoking would be us giving an impression of something. A video game is enacted narration. So however we act with our avatar in the video game world is giving us a way to act out a specific storyline. We are a hero in a video game. We are a kind of protagonist in a video game. Video games have embedded narratives, meaning that things we find in a video game are left there for us for interpretation. And there's the so-called idea of emergent narrations coming from video games, which you can by and large understand as the story that I would make out of playing a video game together with you guys. So let's say after today's streaming session, I'm sitting together with a friend of mine, with my parents. They ask me, what did I do today? I tell them, hey, I played Dear Esther. And my mom loves video games, but that usually restricts to Tetris. So she will ask, what is Dear Esther actually, son? Can you explain it to me? And then I can tell her, well, you start on that island and then you go out exploring. That would be the emergent story of a video game. And hand in hand together with that and the added experience of narration and the aesthetics of a video game, we have an incredibly interesting paper by Oscar Moralde, who says that Dear Esther is actually applying aesthetic principles in a rather interesting fashion. Because what art is usually doing is, static art, like paintings for example, is that they give us a specific frame to look at, and that frame has been aesthetically designed. Now in a video game, we are taking care of our own framing of something, and what the geography of Dear Esther does is quite often it gives us elements that can't really be aligned in the rule of threes, for example, or in any kind of aesthetic pattern that we might find as pleasing. So it might look beautiful for a moment, but then there's always the idea of I have to move, and now I have to, and that's of course something implicitly happen. We're not playing this walking around like I have to cause aesthetic moments, I have to cause aesthetic moments. This is something that just happens implicitly to us because we, as human beings, like to look at beautiful things.
When you were born, your mother told me, a hush fell over the delivery room. A great red birthmark covered the left side of your face. No one knew what to say, so you cried to fill the vacuum. I always admired you for that you cried to fill whatever vacuum you found. I began to manufacture vacuums just to enable you to deploy your talent. The birthmark faded by the time you were 6 and had gone completely by the time we met, but your fascination with the empty and its cure remained.
So with that, we not only just had a wonderful other letter excerpt again, showing us how mysterious and unreliable these letters make the narration of the game. We do not know who is talking right now. We do not know who this letter is addressed to, who it is describing. But at the same time, it gave me a wonderful opportunity to show something off to you guys, namely that this is also aesthetic arrangement. What kind of screen do I want to have in the background when I actually have this letter coming up in front of me? What do I want to look at when I listen to a letter? And in later cases, if you play the game yourself, you will notice, for example, that the letters quite often mention things that you could potentially see in your environment at a given moment. So you definitely, the moment you hear, for example, cave entrance, you're like, okay, there must be a cave around here somewhere. So you automatically look around trying to find the cave and to see it. Now we have talked about Morales. What else can we talk about with the regards to the aesthetic reception of Dear Esther? We can talk about how walking simulators add to that very specific idea, for instance. Of course, would make a lot of sense since we are playing a walking simulator. Perhaps allow me to rearrange the screen before I go through these slides, because this is actually a very cool place to be right now to describe the idea of the sublime and beautiful again for a second. I mean, just look at that wonderful cliff that we are walking through right here. It is a quite impressive piece of landscape. It's extremely high. It's if you see something like this in real life, you get a rather stellar feeling. Of course, in a similar fashion, this happens when we come by one in a video game as well, and at the same time it looks rather dangerous, because the moment we have to pass it, we have to go through this rather dark corridor where we can't really see around the corner and can't see what's happening at the beginning, and this is really embodying the idea of the sublime and beautiful. It's intense landscape that might leave you frightened for a moment. And with the idea of the walking simulator, what we do is that we take this practice of walking through landscape, as we had it in Romanticism, for example, and as described in a paper by Rosa Cabo-Mascarell, into a virtual practice, which is a pretty cool thing to do actually, because we are not just walking through landscape as we would do so in Romanticism, with a very clear eye for what we see, what we hear, how we feel when we are doing this, but we have the utmost luxury and pleasure that in a video game these environments are aesthetically laden with music, with sound effects that might be louder than in actual nature, for instance, with letter excerpts that are passed in, so we are getting some kind of narration together with the landscape that we are passing, and together with all these narrative options that Jenkins mentioned. So every little detail that we find in that video game, we immediately associate with some kind of narrative structure that this virtual environment of the video game is giving us. Every bit and nitbit that we find in there will provide and add to meaning to a specific degree. I see a question coming up by Caterpillar for a VR version of Dear Esther. Dear Caterpillar, rest assured, I'm pretty sure there is a VR mod for Dear Esther out there. If not, I highly recommend you guys to check out the current VR libraries that we have for the PlayStation, for example, but also going on Steam, because yes, this is really the step that people are taking now that VR is becoming more affordable. Walking simulators are predestined for VR technology, and there's more and more games coming along that way. So pay close attention, give that a bit of Google research. I'm pretty sure that you will be utterly impressed by what you find. Fun fact, the latest video game release by the Chinese Room, they have 4 major video game releases so far. Dear Esther was their first one. Then they had Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, a Victorian horror game. They had Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, another quite wonderful and deeply sentimental walking simulator. And their latest game, which sadly was only released for Google Glasses so far, is So Let Us Melt, which is also a walking simulator of sorts. Sadly, I haven't played that one yet because I don't own Google Glasses yet. So I heard that streaming people are usually begging for gifts. If you want to give me Google VR glasses, I'm totally open for that. But yeah, should you have a pair of those, check out the game. If it's coming from the Chinese Room, it's bound to be a wonderful game. So let's continue along our way, because by now I think it's time to actually focus on some of these little details that we can stumble across in the environment. I already told you that we find certain things that might not fully fit into our picture of a left alone Hebridean island. And now keep your fingers crossed, because the cool thing about Dear Esther is that sometimes this appears and sometimes we might not see it, but we are lucky today and we see it. If we explore this beach, which we have no reason and motivation to do so unless it's our own urge to explore something, we can actually find a rather perfect geometrical Fibonacci spiral on the beach. The Fibonacci spiral is a mathematical pattern which happens if you add different squares to one another. So sadly I cannot move around my mouse cursor right now, but if you look at the middle of the screen, you can imagine that we have a 1x1 square in here. We have another 1x1 square added to that. This is turned into a 2x2 square, and so on. To this 2x2 square we add a 2x2 square, 3x3 square, 4x4, and so on and so forth. This is how the Fibonacci spiral expands, giving you this shape that might strike a certain resemblance to you if you looked around nature, because what Fibonacci noticed is that the Fibonacci, or I mean, he didn't call it a Fibonacci spiral. What did he call it? It's the Fibonacci spiral, let's stick to that, is a perfect pattern that is actually quite often found in nature. We can find this pattern, for example, in the spiral shapes of seashells. We can find plant structures resembling this pattern closely if you look at certain plant stumps, for example. We can, however, also find this pattern in the general shape of the universe, which apparently is structured along the line of a Fibonacci spiral. And we also can see it, for example, and I include this for my dear colleague Armin Lippitz, who is a great admirer of tennis as sports. If you twirl a tennis ball and it is wet, the drops will actually fall off or be driven off the tennis ball in a shape excuse me, that resembles a Fibonacci spiral. So Fibonacci was off to the clue that this spiral is actually signifying some hidden truth about the university, not the university, excuse me, maybe also about the university. We are quite a mystical place at times, but about the universe in general, and that this underlying structure, this shape of the spiral must be containing some kind of hidden truth, which is an idea that has been taken up in different kinds of occult schools, which has been taken up again in philosophy over and over again, in esoterics, in mathematics, in all kinds of disciplines. And it's a pattern not only supposedly containing hidden truth, which in the sense of embedded storytelling is giving us an idea of our reason and being on that island, that we might be out here to find some kind of hidden truth. But it's also a very interesting idea because the Fibonacci spiral is by default a pattern of concentric and perpetual repetition. This is something that happens over and over again, but always in bigger circles, in more reaching out circles, which, again, shout out to all my humanities peeps in the live stream right now, is of course something we all know from hermeneutics, namely in shape of the hermeneutic circle. The idea that if we read a text, we gain some kind of understanding. And if we then continue to read other texts, which expand our knowledge and understanding and return to the first text again, we will read it from a completely different perspective. So we will have added knowledge to it. That can be because we read other texts, that can be because we are older, that can be, or we have a different outlook on things, that can be because we have a new understanding through whatever kind of reason, but we return to a somewhat identical point that is still not identical in order to regain more understanding and drive the spiral to the next biggest point coming from that. So this is, of course, and by now we know that if we play video games, we play it for clues. This is a pretty interesting clue to find us. And this, together with all the other things that I've mentioned so far, is an interesting point when we want to talk about the underlying narration of Dear Esther. Now, as already mentioned, it's quite ambiguous as to what this island represents, what's going on there, if it's a real island in a fictitious context, if it's a metaphorical island, if it's maybe a dream that somebody has about an island. But what we can get from different letter excerpts, if we collect them time and time again, and trust me, I collected them time and time again, is that what happened is that we have four people that all of this is revolving around. We have a person called Esther, of course. We have a character named Paul, a character named Jacobson, and a character named Donnelly. And apparently Esther died in a car crash. Now, this might be a reason behind why we find many different parts of car wreckage all across the island. Might also be a reason why we see hospital equipment across the island. It could be a reason behind this. Could be that we are right now in a hospital and experience the island as some kind of feverish dream, perhaps. And this is all, on the one hand, adding up, at the same time puzzling due to the unreliable narration, the unreliable nature of the narrator of the game. Yeah, we're taking free fall to the cliffs. We survived, lucky us. Because there's some elements of the story that add up and some don't add really up. We have talks about Jacobson and Donnelly being people that lived way before us. Jacobson being a shepherd in the 17th century, Donnelly being an explorer or cartographer in the 18th century, Paul and Esther being present-day people, which we can assume to be in the 21st century. We get some letter excerpts that tell us that Paul returned from a conference and crashed into Esther's car, but was sober at that point because he had a celebration, but he completely watched how much he drank. We have other letter excerpts which tell us that Esther was hit by a drunkard on the street. We, at some parts, get clues that might suggest that Paul and Esther are married. At other times, we don't. Sometimes we get an implication that Esther might have been pregnant, which can or cannot be true. This is also something that is never completely proven. And at some points, we find completely outlandish things in the environment, even more outlandish than the Fibonacci spiral that we just discovered on the beach. What you can see here, the turning on of the flashlight, that's something the game does for you automatically. So I don't even have that level of interaction of deciding when I want to turn on the flashlight or not. We are in a spooky abandoned lighthouse. With a bit of luck, we can see a ghost here actually, because if we go through here and look up the lighthouse, sometimes there's a ghost here. Not today, apparently, but do you see that pattern that we have here when we look up the lighthouse? It's a Fibonacci spiral of sorts. It's a bit more circular than the actual Fibonacci spiral, but we can note that we have a spiral pattern coming into place here. And if we walk around, because we can see that there's nothing for us to do and to find here, we will find that on the wall, which is strangely illuminated. I don't know if we have any... a good question, low budget Joker. There's exactly one point in the game where you can die from falling, and it's actually more of an Easter egg than an actual fact. The game is not intended for you to die. If you die, so to speak, by going into the vast darkness of the ocean, you will always be brought back to the island, come back, being the repetitive circular pattern again. And quite interestingly, in some playthroughs, you get a rather concise narrative going on about a metaphorical figure of a bottomless boat. The narrator is mentioning coming to the island on a bottomless boat. There's different fantastic stories mentioned of people who traverse the ocean on bottomless boats. So bottomless might also be an indicator for that falling movement that you're describing, that we go down into something, but the deeper we go down in it, the more it brings us back to the beginning again, because there's always that riddle that we cannot solve, and there's always that more for us to see after the bottom, after being brought back to the beginning again. Now, let's get to our wonderful formula on here. I always wanted to be a pharmacist, but I never got around to being one. So I had to look that up for you guys. And what we have here is the chemical diagram for ethanol or alcohol. And this, again, is a pretty interesting line of way of using embedded storytelling devices, because again, in the beginning, this is pretty puzzling to us. This is simply there with no reason and explanation giving for us on why it is there. But it is, and again, if it's in a video game, it's a clue for us about the environment, so there must be a reason for it to be here. I really like that Dear Esther is dropping a lot of these kind of visual and written hints in its environment, and it's always presented in a way that makes us assume that somebody actually painted it on there. We get chemical diagrams, but we also get citations from the Bible, for example. We get text lines, we get images that resemble as hieroglyphs, and all of them are presented with the same kind of authority. We never get a clear indication on where they're coming from, but they are always there in certain places, and they are always weighted to us as avatar, as visitor, as spectator, as flaneur in the same fashion. So they are all equal with regards to how much they mean to our understanding of the story. And this one is quite interesting because just as the Fibonacci spiral, it's hinting at a deeper truth, but at the same time puzzling it. The meaning of the Fibonacci spiral is clear, but seeing how we get a presentation of the geographical pattern all of a sudden on a beach with no explanation, that is puzzling again. So we are on that verge between understanding and, hey, this is getting more confusing than what I paid for. And the same is going on with the chemical diagram of ethanol or alcohol here, because apparently the car accident has been induced by a toxic driver, by an intoxicated driver, excuse me. So we could, on the one hand, take that as an example for the fact that there's a deep and underlying hint about what's actually going on. But at the same time, of course, simply stumbling upon that is puzzling, because I don't expect many people to know immediately what this is when they see it for the first time. It's also, however, a hint indicating on how we may understand the game world according to our protagonists, apparently. And for that, we should have another look at our protagonists. Let's give me multitasking a try and have me play the video game while talking about the protagonists. We have, as already mentioned, 4 protagonists that are of greater relevance to us in Dear Esther. We have Paul, 21st century, who is a chemist by profession, actually. Oh, there was a bird. That bird doesn't always enter when you, the bird doesn't always leave the building when we leave the building, so that was a pretty exciting sight. One of the rare instances where we have actual interaction with another being in the game world. And Paul was on the way home from a conference from Exeter, is what some letter excerpts tell us when we explored the island. We have Esther, who died in a car crash and who somebody dedicated these letters to. However, again, we can still not be sure who wrote these letters actually and who is reading them. Yeah, even that would be a differentiation, who wrote and who reads them out aloud to us. It's also quite interesting to note that these excerpts sometimes have a quite different intonation. The credits of Dear Esther only mention one voice artist for the narrator, but at the same time I cannot shake off the feeling that some of them sound really different with regards to intonation. And we have Donnelly, the 18th century cartographer. In a later part of the game we can actually find a book from Donnelly in another abandoned abode across the island. Same goes for Jacobson, who was supposed to be a shepherd on the island and who had his own hut and lineage, but who, according to some letter excerpts at least, died alone on that island. And strangely enough, things get even more confusing thanks to the credits again, because we have our protagonists named in here as Paul Jacobson and Esther Donnelly. So depending on what kind of letter excerpts we get, we might actually be inclined to believe that Esther and Donnelly are the same people and that Paul and Jacobson are the same people. At the same time, they aren't. So there's a lot mixed going on in here, a grand mixture of different ideas of what our characters are or can be, which again leads us to believe that most of what we see here is metaphorical, because we have 4 people that are looking for isolation and solitude. We have different letter excerpts telling us that Paul and Esther apparently visited this island sometime, so there was a reason for them to go there. Jacobson went there to herd his sheep, to be in solitude. Donnelly went there out of a spirit of exploration. All of them different motivations to be on an island, and all of them potentially seeking different things.
The mount is clearly the focal point of this landscape. It almost appears so well placed as to be artificial. I find myself easily slipping into the delusional state of ascribing purpose, deliberate motive to everything here. Was this island formed during the moment of impact? When we were torn loose from our moorings, and the seatbelts cut motorway lanes into our chests and shoulders, did it first break surface then?
Another letter excerpt, a great short coffee break for me, and a wonderful narrative clue again about the unreliability of the narration going on here, because what this letter does and what several other letters do is that they kind of refer to the island as being an artificial place. This one in a more obvious fashion than the others. Sometimes you get the opening letter line, "Dear Esther." I sometimes feel as if I've given birth to this island, implying that the island either didn't have meaning or didn't even exist before us as avatars entered the island. And with that, of course, also greatly raising the question of not only who is the narrator, but who are we as the avatar? Are we the narrator ourselves? Could it be that these letters come from Paul? Then again, we have some letter excerpts that mention Paul as a protagonist. Matilda, thank you for your question. Yeah, these letter excerpts are mostly arbitrary. They only follow a pattern in the fact that there's always certain locations on the island that spawn the appearance of the letters. And it seems to be that all letters that spawn usually spawn from a specific pool of letters. So I think there's roughly 50 or 60 letter pieces in total. And in the beginning, for example, there's always a total of 4 to 5 different letters that could be read out to us in the beginning, because the game, I think, almost always begins with a letter beginning with "Dear Esther" as an introduction to the game. And other letters, for example, about the cave that we can explore on that island, will only appear later when we are a bit deeper in the island. But then again, there's different letters about the cave that could appear to us. And still, we don't really know who we are as an avatar. Are we one of the cast members? Could we be Paul? Could we be Esther? Could we be Donnelly? Could we be Jacobson? Could we be one of them but in a different state of being? So are we maybe the ghost of Jacobson wandering the island? Are we Esther or Paul?
When someone had died or was dying, or was so ill they gave up what little hope they could sacrifice, they cut parallel lines into the cliff, exposing the white chalk beneath. You could see them from the mainland or the fishing boat, and know to send aid or impose a cordon of protection, and wait a generation until whatever pestilence stalked the cliff paths died along with its hosts. My lines are just for this, to keep any would-be rescuers at bay. The infection is not simply of the flesh.
Another mysterious letter excerpt, this time showing you what I meant with giving clear reference to the virtual environment, because one of the little actions that we can do actually is zoom in, so I'm going to do that right now. This letter was talking about lines being drawn into the cliff and we can see them from here. rather big lines they are, so it's really difficult to decipher how human-made they could be, but they definitely are here and visible for us as we continue along our path, wondering who we are as an avatar. The game gets even more mysterious towards the end, because in the very end of the game we have reached the radio signal tower that we can see in the back here, and we are climbing atop of it and take a plunge from it, only to what appears to be us turning into a bird to finally leave that island. So it could even be that we as an avatar are on the one hand embodied in the video game environments, but at the same time we are not part of a main cast of characters at all, but more or less here truly as a flaneur, as a visiting flaneur, to understand and see and decipher something for ourselves.
Motley lot with little to recommend them. I have now spent 3 days in their company. That is, I fear, enough for any man not born amongst them. Despite their tedious inclination to quote scripture, they seem to me the most godforsaken to be adrift from any chance of redemption. Did he include himself in that, I wonder?
All in all, we by now have identified that the island is a utopos. It's a place of non-existence. It's a place that looks like a real place, but drops indication after indication that something mysterious is about this, making us consider the idea of the mental island. So islands as a representation of a mental change of being. Matilda dropping the awesome questions here. Thank you. Note the weather is actually not changing. We always get windy, stormy, cloudy weather. However, what's changing is a day-night cycle. So by the end of the video game, in the last chapter, it will be night. And this is creating another kind of very symbolic atmosphere. Again, simply because we won't be able to reach that gameplay state by today, please check out Dear Esther. It's really worth seeing what's going on in here. If we consider the island as a utopos, and not just as a utopos of non-existence, but as a specific place of non-existence that we made up in order to do something, in order to tell a story, or in order to gain some understanding, we can see that an important feature of the island is, of course, the sea as an isolating boundary, with a role or a strong emphasis onto the role of the journey, going hand in hand again together with our understanding of the utopia and dystopia. It's a secluded space to be. In Dear Esther, we have descriptions of all the main cast that they had reason to be on that island, and at points even descriptions on how they entered that island. Again, think about the metaphor of the bottomless boat. And think about the mere meaning it has to take a journey. A journey means that you willingly decide that you have to leave a specific place in order to be at another place. In the case of the island of Dear Esther, for example, in order to come to realizations, or to come to an understanding, to come to an acceptance perhaps of what happened in that situation revolving around the car crash. And this is a motive that has popped up again and again in different literary traditions. For example, think about the Irish Imrama, which are tales of sea voyages of saints who were sent out onto a quest. They wanted to achieve something, and on their quest they hopped from island to island, describing what they learned during their voyages, what they found out on different fantastic islands, and what they achieved by doing this journey. But also by the 15th and mainly 16th century literary tradition of the Isolarios, the island fiction where you have kind of travel descriptions of islands, sometimes even accompanied by maps. These could be descriptions of real islands, but also of fictitious islands, for example. And especially in Western literature and in Western literary tropes in general, a very important motive is the idea of establishing a narrative of self-realization via the island. Think about our very first grand novel, which we have about the modern human being. Think about Robinson Crusoe, which is all about the human being alone on the island, because in that solitude, he as a human being realized to himself what it means to be a human being, what differentiates himself, and what, in his opinion, is, for example, necessary to be accountable for a kind of, even if it's just a single person society or societal structure. What does it actually mean to be us, which is, in a sense, what's happening to us in our representation of the avatar in here, what is shaping our understanding. And we are on that island where we always have to come back, this endless repetitive cycle that's adding more and more to our understanding, while still puzzling us, but maybe also giving us a signal that our knowledge will still be ever evolving and yet clueless. Quite interestingly, the island metaphor has a very specific role in British society, which is a point that I want to get briefly towards at the very end of this lecture again, because according to Alex Law, who has followed the British island motif throughout history, of course with a major focus on the British Empire and the British Isles as the kind of navel of the British Empire. We have a lost vision nowadays of Britain as an inclusive open island utopia. So there's always reason to be at the island from a British or specifically British perspective, which is quite interesting, I think, because in my dissertation, for example, I'm looking also at how the cultural background changes a video game, and seeing that we have a video game coming from a British developer that so specifically deals not only with a British representation of an island, but also with a British understanding of an island as a utopia. Utopia as a perfect place, in the sense of maybe we have a perfect non-existent place, but a place nevertheless where everything about that car crash and accident might make sense all of a sudden, because we get littered with clues that are puzzling, but yet all being brought together in one decisive space that we cannot escape from right now, unless we think we have achieved some kind of understanding. That is my idea of the openly inviting utopia, drawing us into the island, into the space of solitude that we can make an understanding of, due to the fact that this is a walking simulator that grants us that peace to achieve that understanding for ourselves. And with that, we actually come to specific conclusions about Dear Esther's version of the utopia and dystopia already. Again, with a strong focus and reference to our idea of a spatial utopia, not a political or ideological utopia, but the utopia and dystopia as a secluded space. We can see that the back and forth between both of them in the video game representation of utopia and dystopia, that is Dear Esther, is coming from the liminality created by player vision and promenading. This island is what it is, and it is what it is because we take a look and peek at certain things. It is meaning to us because we decide to make explorations, or maybe we decide we do not want to explore and just follow a straight line to the end of the island where we reach that radio point, of course, just to start the game again and maybe get different clues this time. Depending on how we wander, we have beautifully aesthetic visions of a beautiful island. Perhaps it's depending on how we change our camera angle, it's a rather horrifically sublime representation of the island that evokes horror in us. Maybe we puzzle clues together, maybe we don't, maybe we ignore clues, maybe we spend so much time understanding these clues that things make sense to us, at least in our current playthrough of going through the island. And also in the sense of a non-place, and I really love this, Jenkins describes video games as memory palaces, again with reliance to his narrative options that he mentioned about different aesthetic premises and props that we can find in the video game environment. And I would even like to go a step further and call Dear Esther an impossible memory palace, because as we found out, this island cannot be a photorealistic representation of a real island. Also, if you play it yourself, think about geography, for example, because at one point we go pretty deep down into a cave, much deeper than we think we could actually go down into a cave at that given island. But it's a memory palace nonetheless. It's an impossible non-place that unites things that couldn't otherwise be united in that very specific order and constellation, also regarding the letter excerpts, for example, to give us a utopian feeling and a dystopian feeling. And what I really liked is a remark by Miss Mary Cavalcante-Schubach, who states that, as worded, the time of utopia, so we are talking about the temporal dimensions for a moment as well, is indeed neither past nor future. It is coincidental, transitional, and gerundive. The time of a turn where the after the end and the before the beginning meet each other. So we had that situation with the car crash, and on that island, we are on the one hand on a very serene and peaceful state before something chaotic or catastrophic happens, because we're also taken back in time by characters like Jacobson, by Donnelly. But at the same time, we are in an after the end state where the island is riddled with things that shouldn't be there, that couldn't be there, and that allow us to combine this peaceful calm of making explorations for ourselves and the understanding of the tragedy that happened, that real dense and intense state in between a utopian feeling about the island and a dystopian feeling about the island. So with that as concluding thoughts for today's lecture, we could say that video games, as we could see on the example of Dear Esther, offer us pretty interesting artistic ways of creating an outlet to explore good and bad non-places. Per se, each video game environment is a virtual environment, so it is a non-place already, and we can create visions of how these non-places look like, and we have very interesting ways of communicating and understanding of these non-places to the player, depending on how we want to focus interaction. Do we want the players to be mere walking flaneurs, looking at things and taking things in? Are we able to make moral choices in a video game, for instance? All these aspects can be pretty darn interesting with regards to making utopian and dystopian understandings. We have Dear Esther as offering a game world in which utopia and dystopia culminate in player agency. So again, it's up to us in order to decipher all the narrative options that we have at hand and to make the most of it, but also to repeat agency. Agency in replaying the game again and give it and thereby getting different impressions of the island. And quite interestingly, this culmination is a typically British sentiment, I'd argue, due to its reliance to the sublime and beautiful, which is a very important tradition in British art, to the idea of the game being set in a British setting on a Hebridean island with a backstory that takes place in Great Britain, and with many, many typical motives that we know from British art and literature. The island motive, the idea of island exploration, the mental island as a state of utopian solitude. And therefore, I think, and maybe in a quite hopeless sense of making sense of not just this video game, but also my dissertation in the very end, we can argue that there's a lot of reason for us to focus on research, or to focus our research efforts on cultural and architectural, or the cultural architecture of video games, meaning the sense of how we can actually virtually design cultural virtual environments for us to explore and to learn something from. And with that, I thank you very, very much. I'm having a quick look at our stream again. We are still at 106 viewers, so nobody of you dozed off, or maybe you dozed off and didn't look out due to that. In any case, I thank you very much for taking this trip across the island of Dear Esther today with me together. And as promised, I'll be in this chat room until, let's say precisely 2 p.m. I'll be in the chat to answer your questions, and of course I'll also remain logged into the game. We won't be able to finish the Esther in 20 minutes even with a speed run, but if there's things that you would like me to explore for the time being, or to just walk around, I'll definitely find a way of doing so. So what we're going to do right now, simply because we have time for it, I'll simply continue my exploration for a little while, briefly checking the chat now and then to see if you guys have any questions going on that I can answer for you. With that, I can also offer you a bit of descriptions of what I think is interesting. For example, I think that the fauna of the island is really intriguing, simply because it's moving constantly due to the wind. This is actually, it's rather simple models in the game world, so they don't take up a lot of computer processing power, but the mere fact that we are walking through this movement field of plantation is absolutely beautiful, and it's also giving grounds for a very important element of experiencing this walking simulator, namely the sound effects of the wind. We really feel a close connection to our environment here, which is something that many walking simulators do in an extremely wonderful fashion, which I really, really enjoy. And which is what walking simulators should really be about, making us feel like we're not just a spectator here or visitor, but we are part of this environment while we're here. Okay, I have a question by Ludo Lobster coming in. Ludo Lobster is asking, what do you make of games like Dark Souls played out of bonds where people walk around, look and explore outside the internet boundaries? Wonderful question, Ludo Lobster. A game not made for that purpose is essentially turning into a walking simulator. Do you think this provides a fundamentally different experience? Yes and no. Yes and no. What your question stresses here, and what I also love pretty much about video games, is that in contrast to other forms of media representation, and in contrast to films and books, for example, a video game is not only what the developers give us, but also what we as players make of it. Allow me to quickly step a few slides back, because I think I actually have a important remark on that somewhere here. I am of the opinion that the video game always is an experience that is created by the developer who made the virtual environment, by the game, so by the moment of us playing the game, and by the players alike. So there's people bringing their own cultural knowledge into how they design a game, then there's the final product, the game, and there's us enjoying the game, but also enjoying the game to how we make sense of that. Which can lead to pretty interesting things like games that are not to be intended or not intended as walking simulators like Dark Souls, but people treat them as walking simulators. I think one decisive factor for me, and at least in my current argumentation for the dissertation, is that in a walking simulator, in order to be considered a walking simulator, the focus should really be on the essential fact of walking. Now, in Dark Souls, a lot of the game environment is puzzling, but quite soon we get quests, we get challenges, we get told what to do, ring the bell of awakening in the first one we had it, for example. And we also have a rather specific sense of urgency and immediacy, because we expect enemies to be attacking us. We expect other players to invade our game world. Whereas in the walking simulator, the main focus really is on what Guy Debord encapsulated with his idea of the reef, of the idea that we can, in all peace and quietness and solitude, walk an environment and really have the only thing that's driving us being our own impetus of walking around in that virtual world, and nothing really deterring us from the fact that we are walking here. Again, we have many cases where this is highly dubious and questionable, as we always have. Yeah, the moment you have a genre definition, you immediately have to find that one piece or that one film that completely breaks with your definition. For example, I'm really teeth gnawing right now regarding my dissertation with regards to a rather recent video game coming out last October called Death Stranding, which is a game about walking. But at the same time, it's a rather motivationally driven game about walking, because you're playing a courier who has to walk from one place to another. So you have specific goals for your walking activity in mind, and at the same time, you have a strong focus on walking. And right now, I'm still not quite sure what to make of it, because I would love to call it a walking simulator, simply because it literally is about walking and everything else is just a bonus. But in contrast to Death Stranding, Dear Esther literally only is about walking without any kind of time pressure, without any kind of quotas to fulfill with regards of delivering packages, without us having to connect places and people with one another.
I met Paul. I made my own little pilgrimage. My Damascus, a small semi-detached on the outskirts of Wolverhampton. We drank coffee in his kitchen and tried to connect to one another. Although he knew I hadn't come in search of an apology, reason or retribution, he still spiraled in panic, thrown high and lucid by his own dented bonnet. Responsibility had made him old. Like us, he'd already passed beyond any conceivable boundary of life.
So with that, we have again another quite interesting clue coming in letter shape, because the letter is stating that I met Paul. So in this playthrough of Dear Esther, we can therefore, or are inclined to assume, that the narrator is not Paul, because Paul wouldn't address a letter to himself. At least that's what we can assume for the time being. At the same time, it's still very unclear if we have a narrator who made a pilgrimage and now is on that island, or if we are playing Paul and this letter is played into our consciousness for whatever different reason going on here. Mystery after mystery. I'm not trying to go to that trawler over here, because sadly this time you cannot. I tried several times, you always drown. But what we can do is take a very quick look into this cavern over here.
Would leave you presents outside your retreat in this interim space between cliff and beach. I would leave you loaves and fishes, but the fish stocks have been depleted and I've run out of bread. I would row you back to your homeland in a bottomless boat, but I fear we would both be driven mad by the chatter of the sea creatures.
That was a mentioning of the bottomless boat that is quite often cited as some kind of source of info. This is very interesting because on my last playthrough I didn't notice this being here. Could be man-made, could be bird shit. The cool thing is right now we just don't know. Are you allowed to say shit on Twitch? I don't know, I just did. Hope they don't block me. What we have here is a hieroglyph of what is a neural cell. So this is something that you would have in your nervous system. Again, without any explanation on what this is doing here, who left it as a trace. We have more chemical formulas, this time kinda ebbing out to the left and to the right. And should you be able to make sense of what this is, because I couldn't do that so far. I think it's a real interesting painting, a real interesting kind of hieroglyph, but so far I have no clue as to what it could represent. All I know is that we have other cell-like structures with dendrites in the end. We have other tree-like structures. And again, nothing of interaction to be done in here. It's just us finding this place, being curious about what it could be, exploring it, and then, if we do want to do so, carry on with different parts of island exploration. Yeah, I get a remark seeing them as seeing these white splatters as man-made stuff of white paint. Also quite interesting because we get a remark of in some playthroughs at least, of a fluorescent mushroom glowing in one of the caves of the game, and certain protagonists maybe adding these mushrooms to paint or using paint for whatever reason. But then again, we would have to question what kind of person would be the one dropping paint here. We have music playing in again. We have another remark from Ludo Lobster talking about time sensitivity and not time sensitivity in Death Stranding. Thank you very much for mentioning these points. I have a remark from Rooksy as well. So I arrived close to the end, so perhaps you've already mentioned it, but is the sublime here the one that doesn't involve beauty, but rather the intimidating scope of nature? Both, actually, Rooksy. That's the real interesting point about the sublime. Let me quickly go back to the painting that I provided for you guys on here. First of all, allow me to... Oh, no, that's too far back. First of all, allow me to always call it the sublime and beautiful in one sentence, because they usually go hand in hand. And the idea really is that something is sublime for the very fact that there's a duality in it. The sublime is awe-inspiring. It's something that we think is utterly impressive, For example, that could also be when you're located in Klagenfurt right now. If you look out a window and you see the mountain range, it's utterly impressive. It's big. It's something that only nature could create in that way. So that is beautiful, but at the same time, it's rising that tingling, that little bit of goosebumps feeling, or that flawed feeling in your stomach about it, because these places are also dangerous places. You could fall from a mountain. There's elements that might be weather, might be something else that could be harmful to you if you're all by yourself in that mountain range. There's that feeling of feeling insignificant around a mountainside, for example, or around the rough cliffs of an island, as we have it in Dear Esther. I mean, the island looks beautiful, but it's the same. Maybe let's use the cave again for an example. On the one hand, it's pretty impressive for us to note and awe-inspiring. Also, if we imagine to see this in real life, for example, a cave that large. Caves are impressive because caves are something that comes to existence simply because water is holding out that place over thousands and eons of years, maybe. Also being responsible for creating stalagmites, for example, as we can see them in here. That is something awe-inspiring and impressive, but at the same time, us being alone in that cave emits a kind of scary feeling. Because whatever this cave represents and is, it is so much more than we are from our mere humble human point of existence. So yeah, thank you for that question. It's always that in-between feeling of awe-inspiring, but being aroused in a specifically horrific way in what we see. Edmund Burke, for example, used the precise terminology of the sublime and beautiful being the delightful terror of being in these natural landscapes. It's a delight to see what we see, but at the same time, it would be a rather scary feeling for us being lost in such an empty, vast, big, huge, empowering environment. Yeah, so your self-made definition that I can see here in the chat, Roxy, makes total sense in these circumstances. Exactly due to that duality. It's awe-inspiring, but in a slightly different way, because it's not just awe-inspiring because it is beautiful, but also because it is powerful. And at the same time, it's horrific, not just because it's scaring us, but also because it's scary how scary something beautiful like a vast landscape can be. A real delicate middle ground here.
I've become convinced I'm not alone here, even though I'm equally sure it is simply a delusion brought upon by circumstance. I do not, for instance, remember where I found the candles, or why I took it upon myself to light such a strange pathway. Perhaps it is only for those who are bound to follow.
So with that letter excerpt, for example, again, we could make the assumption that narrator and avatar are not the same person, because later on we will find lit candles on the island, and it seems like the narrator left them here. However, again, we have to keep in mind it's the same narrator who at times drops letter excerpts or reads them out aloud to us that might contradict one another. A pretty interesting structure we find here, not only because, again, we get some pretty weird hieroglyphs on it, but because in landscape aestheticism and in aesthetic practices and schools dealing with landscapes, you can learn that the obelisk, let me quickly, I have a pretty cool book in here, I can only recommend it actually, Walkscapes, Walking as an Aesthetic Praxis by Francesco Carreri around here, who is describing these phenomena, and according to whom we can see that an obelisk such as the one we can see here, or the more proper term for it would actually be something else, namely the menhir. Yeah, that's the word. The menhir is actually one of the first architectural structures of mankind. When mankind developed architecture back in its very primitive stage. Architecture was making paths and having things besides these paths, namely these menhirs. And one interesting aspect about it is that menhirs were not always used as markers of orientation, so they weren't placed for the specific purpose of marking something, but actually as an aesthetic practice already. So we have ancient menhirs who were just besides ancient paths because it looked like something apparently to the people back then. At least that's what we can assume. And quite interestingly, we find 2 books here. An introductory to chemistry. Okay. And another book that we cannot really make out what it is right now. Could be a Bible, doesn't have to be a Bible. Would be rather thin for a Bible, actually. But yeah, I'm pretty sure I didn't see these books on my last playthrough either, so again, that's a clue that you don't get all the time. That could be it. Thank you very much for the hint, Matilda. Could be a only New Testament version of the Bible. But then again, all we get on the cover is a cross, and again, the cool thing about embedded environmental storytelling, everything else is up to our interpretation. What book is it? What does the book mean? Why is the book there? We cannot answer right now. Okay, I'm not really sure I want to drop down there, because we only have 5 minutes left, so maybe I can show you a bit more of the island as I continue walking. Let's take a path here. I also love how certain video games just manage to create atmosphere via light, because the environmental light isn't changing, but due to us being in that specific part of the island now, everything is getting dark, almost nightlight, and that is used as a traversal tool to introduce the next chapter of the video game, which might be a pretty good starting point for us. Matilda, yeah, that is a very interesting question for you to raise. And this is also really relevant with regards to our understanding.
And survey maps, I simply cannot find the location. You'd think there would be marks to serve as some evidence. It's somewhere between the turnoff for Sanford and the welcome break services. But although I can always see it in my rearview mirror, I have as yet been unable to pull ashore.
Sorry, didn't want to talk over that letter excerpt. But yeah, you're right. It seems to be a world without a lot of joy, because all the things we find so far deal with the protagonists, which then again link us back to all kinds of different tragedies. Esther dying in a car crash. Of course, we know by now that we can assume that Jacobson died on that island, that Donnelly died on that island. And yet, it's a question that we have to ask with regards to, on the one hand, coping with tragedy and trauma. So, would it be utopian for us to be able to deal with a tragic happenstance that we couldn't deal with otherwise? And what are the general expectations that we have of a utopia? Does utopia, in the sense of it being a good place, always mean that it has to be a happy place? Or is a good place, for example, a place like in Professor Helbig's session last week in Pleasantville, where people are seemingly happy, but in a fashion that we, from our perspective, wouldn't consider to be happy? Yeah, again, consider that idea of us being the traveler, being on that journey to that island here, or being the traveler going to Pleasantville, and the person having the outsider's perspective of evaluating a utopia. Or could utopia, in the sense of a good place, mean that this is simply something that is a good place because it brings things together that couldn't be brought together otherwise? So yeah, maybe something for a philosophical essay if you have to write one this semester. Is a good place always a happy place? And there, if you pay close attention, or if you paid close attention, we could for a brief moment on the edge of that cliff see a ghostly figure disappearing in the background. Somebody's watching us. Or at least we imagine somebody watching us. There it was again. So yes, could a good place also be a non-place, as in Dear Esther, that it is utopian for the mere fact that it is a non-existent place where a person needs a place, maybe to cope, maybe to think about something, maybe to achieve solitude in order to make sense of happenings, or does it always have to be a happy place? With that, I see the clock striking 2 o'clock. I hope I gave you some inspirational thought fodder. All the lecture slides are online. If there are any more questions about the lecture material, there will be a place for you to ask on Moodle, if I'm correctly aware of this. And Chiaki-san already joining us for a playthrough. That's the spirit. Thank you very much for that. It's been an utmost pleasure playing video games today with you guys. Please do enjoy the rest of your day. Play some walking simulators if you find the time, and enjoy. See ya.